In this gripping story, Elliot Carter, a successful black businessman, becomes the target of blatant racism when Officer Daniels, a racist cop, unjustly harasses him during a routine interaction. Despite his calm demeanor and attempts to de-escalate the situation, Daniels insists on humiliating and targeting him based purely on his race. The conflict intensifies as public outrage grows, and Elliot is forced to confront not just the officer's prejudice, but the larger systemic racism that still plagues society. The story highlights the deep-rooted racial biases that continue to affect lives, sparking a powerful fight for justice. The city was just beginning to wake up. Bathed in the soft orange hues of early morning light, traffic was light, the usual hum of life not quite at full volume yet, but it was there, a quiet buzz of movement beneath the surface. In the heart of the bustling metropolis, tucked between sleek skyscrapers and luxury condos, was a modest little cafe, Elliot's Corner. It was the kind of place you might miss if you weren't paying attention, but for those who knew, it was home. Elliot Carter sat at his usual table, a low-key corner booth with a view of the street. He'd been coming here for years, far before he was a renowned name in the city's corporate world. A simple man, dressed in a fitted navy sweater and jeans, he didn't look the part of the CEO of one of the fastest-growing tech companies in the region. There was no expensive suit, no gold watch or flashy accessories to signal his wealth and power. For Elliot, humility was the key to his success, and, more importantly, it was how he wanted to live. The barista behind the counter, a young woman with a soft smile, approached his table with a fresh cup of coffee. "Morning, Mr. Carter," she said politely, setting the steaming mug down before him. "Your usual?" Elliot smiled up at her, his warm brown eyes crinkling at the corners. "Just the way I like it," he said, his voice calm and steady. He was a man of few words when it wasn't necessary. He appreciated this, the small exchange that made the world feel less transactional and more personal. "Enjoy your day," she said, walking back to the counter, her eyes flicking toward the other patrons, before she disappeared into the back. As Elliot sipped his coffee, he couldn't help but reflect on the life he had built. He had come from humble beginnings, raised in a neighborhood where opportunity wasn't handed out freely, and where prejudice was as common as the morning sun. But he had found a way out, working his way to the top of the tech world through a blend of sheer determination, talent, and strategy. It hadn't been easy, it still wasn't, but he had made it. Yet, despite his success, the world around him, especially in spaces where people didn't know him, still saw him as something else. The tall, broad-shouldered black man sitting in a cafe in the heart of the city, sipping his coffee in jeans and a sweater, was often met with dismissive glances. People underestimated him, assumed that he didn't belong, that his presence was some anomaly. Even now, in the plush, well-furnished interior of Elliot's Corner, a few tables over, an elderly couple was whispering to one another, their eyes flickering over to him, before turning away quickly. It wasn't overt, but it was there. The small signs that told him he wasn't always seen for who he truly was. A successful entrepreneur, a visionary who had built a business empire from the ground up. It was as if the world couldn't quite reconcile the fact that someone like him, someone who didn't fit the mold, could have achieved such success. Elliot turned his attention back to the street. The early morning rush of cars had started to pick up, and the first few pedestrians were beginning to cross the street, bundled up in jackets against the autumn chill. He knew that, eventually, people would start recognizing him for who he was, but until then, he would continue to show up, day after day, sitting quietly in his corner, resisting the urge to prove himself to anyone. Just as he was beginning to enjoy the quiet of the morning, the bell above the cafe door jingled as it opened. A well-dressed man walked in, his designer suit clearly visible, even in the early morning light. He was tall, with slicked back hair, and a briefcase in hand. The man scanned the room briefly, his gaze flickering over the few patrons, before settling on Elliot. He paused for a moment, clearly surprised, before making his way over. "Mr. Carter, I didn't expect to find you here," the man said, his voice carrying an undertone of curiosity, but also something else. Contempt. Disbelief. It was hard to tell. Elliot didn't need to look up, he recognized the man instantly. Gregory Winters, a competitor in the tech industry. He had met Gregory a few times at corporate events, where his sharp suits and smooth charm were always on full display. Gregory didn't take kindly to being overshadowed, and he never hid his skepticism about Elliot's rise to power. "Gregory," Elliot replied, his voice calm but measured. "I like to keep a low profile when I'm off the clock." Gregory chuckled, a low, almost patronizing sound. "Low profile, huh? Is this your idea of blending in?" He gestured to Elliot's simple attire. Elliot set down his coffee, finally meeting Gregory's gaze. "I'm comfortable here, I don't need the spotlight to feel successful." His voice was steady, but there was an underlying sharpness in his words that only Gregory seemed to notice. Gregory paused, as if trying to process the unexpected reply. He stood there for a moment longer, clearly unsure of how to handle the situation, but, deciding it wasn't worth his time, he quickly recovered with a practiced smile. "Well, if you're not too busy with your simple life, we should grab lunch sometime. I'd love to talk about a few things." Elliot could tell the offer wasn't about business. It was more a calculated attempt to remind him of their power dynamic. Gregory was still trying to fit Elliot into the box of a man who should be grateful for an invitation. Someone who should be eager for validation. "I'll pass," Elliot said smoothly, picking up his coffee again. "But thanks for stopping by." Gregory's smile faltered briefly, and Elliot caught the hint of something dark in his eyes before he turned on his heel and walked toward the door. As the door swung shut behind him, the tension in the cafe seemed to lift, but Elliot couldn't shake the feeling that the encounter had been more than just a casual exchange. It wasn't the first time he had encountered this kind of attitude from others in his industry. The subtle underestimation, the casual dismissiveness that seemed to follow him everywhere, was constant. Despite the boardrooms he had conquered, the millions he had made, the acclaim that had come with his success, the truth remained. Elliot Carter, the black CEO, would always be seen differently. He would always have to prove himself, whether he was in a business meeting or it seemed even in a quiet corner cafe. But today, Elliot felt something else. The weight of a brewing storm. The world outside, in all its complexity and contradictions, seemed to be on the edge of a shift. Even in this quiet cafe, the city around him was changing. The social climate was tense, the tensions of racial inequality, prejudice, and systemic biases running high. The cracks in the system were becoming more visible. People were starting to question authority, to stand up in the face of injustice. And Elliot Carter, in his quiet, unassuming way, knew that he could no longer stay silent. He took a deep breath, his fingers lightly gripping the edge of his coffee mug, and knew that soon enough, his modest life, the one he had carefully curated, would be thrust into the middle of a conflict far larger than anything he had ever anticipated. The morning continued to unfold at a leisurely pace, with the hum of city life outside growing louder as more cars filled the streets and pedestrians streamed past the cafe window. Elliot sat back in his seat, savoring the last sips of his coffee, but his thoughts were anything but peaceful. The encounter with Gregory had left a bitter taste in his mouth. He knew the subtle dismissal he'd faced, Gregory's condescending tone and his thinly veiled attempt to remind Elliot of his place, was far from unique in the world he inhabited. The boardrooms where billion-dollar deals were struck, the gala events where he rubbed shoulders with the city's most powerful people. He had seen it all. But it wasn't just in the corporate spaces where he faced this discrimination. It was in the quiet moments, in the spaces where his title and his success didn't matter. A man like him, a black man, would always have to prove himself, no matter the circumstances. As he finished his coffee, Elliot noticed a car pulling up in front of the cafe, a luxury sedan, glossy black with dark-tinted windows. The car stopped at the curb, and a well-dressed man in his mid-30s stepped out, adjusting his perfectly tailored suit. Elliot didn't know him personally, but the man's sharp features, confidence, and air of importance were unmistakable. He was one of the city's top real estate developers, someone who had made his fortune in properties Elliot had once been interested in. The man glanced around, not once looking inside the cafe, his eyes scanning the sidewalk in a practiced motion, as if he were too important to acknowledge anything outside of his own immediate interests. He straightened his tie, ignoring the young woman at the door who greeted him. She was a lowly employee, likely not even on his radar. It wasn't the man's arrogance that bothered Elliot, it was the look of disdain that lingered in the developer's gaze when his eyes finally flicked to Elliot. The young woman, clearly uncomfortable, adjusted her posture as she spoke to the developer. But she was cut off before she could even finish her greeting. His eyes narrowed for a split second, as if acknowledging her presence. But his expression softened as he began speaking to her. Elliot had seen this before. Dismissiveness, an unspoken rule in the world of wealth and power. It didn't matter what title someone held. The black man with the wealth still didn't measure up. For a moment, Elliot's jaw clenched. His fingers tightened around the edge of his coffee cup as he watched the exchange. He wanted to confront the man, to call him out, but he resisted the urge. This was not his battle today. Or at least, that's what he told himself. When the developer left the cafe without acknowledging Elliot again, he couldn't shake the feeling of being invisible. It wasn't just Gregory. There were other moments like this. Instances where Elliot's presence was questioned, his success dismissed. His phone buzzed, breaking his thoughts. He looked down at the screen. The name on the caller ID made his heart skip a beat. Samantha Carter. His sister. "Hey Sam," Elliot said, lifting the phone to his ear, pushing away his frustrations for the moment. "Elliot!" Samantha's voice was brisk, filled with urgency. "You need to turn on the news." Elliot's brow furrowed. "What's going on?" "It's all over the local news. About the protest. You might want to see this." Her voice softened. "I think it's tied to you." He paused. What are you talking about?" "Just turn on the news, please, it's getting heated." Her voice wavered slightly, a crack in her usual composure. Elliot didn't hesitate. He stood up, throwing a couple of bills on the table, and made his way to the front door. His mind raced, his thoughts a blur. Was this about his company? About his personal life? Whatever it was, he had learned over the years that it wasn't always what you did that made the news. It was about the image others had of you. Elliot stepped outside into the cool morning air, heading toward his car parked a block away. He could already hear the faint sounds of a crowd gathering. People were talking loudly, their voices rising in frustration and anger. As he approached his car, he pulled out his phone, pulling up the local news app. What he saw made his stomach drop. A viral video had surfaced, one of the most infamous videos in recent memory. A young black man being thrown out of a prestigious, well-known retail store in the city. The video showed the man being escorted out by a security guard after a brief altercation with the store manager. The man in the video had been accused of stealing, though the video evidence told a very different story. The crowd on the video was demanding justice, shouting for accountability, but what stood out most to Elliot was the fact that the man in the video had been wearing a suit, his appearance neat and professional. But the moment he was asked to leave the store, his well-dressed exterior didn't matter. He had been racially profiled, treated as a threat. Elliot watched the footage, his anger building with each second. This wasn't just another incident, it was a systemic problem. The assumptions about the black man's identity, how his presence was deemed unworthy of even the most basic level of decency in a public space. As the video ended, the reporter's voice echoed in his mind. What happens when the rules don't apply to everyone, when the very systems meant to protect us become tools for prejudice? He could feel his pulse quicken, his breath shallow. The video was everywhere now, and people were calling for action. The outrage, the frustration, it was palpable across the city. And for the first time, Elliot realized the world was finally listening. The injustice that had long simmered beneath the surface was boiling over, and now it was demanding to be seen. Elliot knew the man in the video. It was his younger cousin, Marcus. He had heard of Marcus's troubles, how he had been trying to break into the high-end tech world, battling stereotypes and corporate barriers at every step. But he had never imagined it would go this far. Marcus wasn't just a victim of racial profiling, he was a symbol, a reflection of everything Elliot had fought against, but had yet to fully address. The phone buzzed in his hand again. This time it was Marcus. "Uncle Elliot," Marcus said, his voice strained, as if trying to keep himself together. "I need your help." Elliot took a deep breath, steadying himself. "I'm here, Marcus." "What's happening?" "It's bad. Real bad," Marcus muttered, his voice breaking. "I can't believe they're doing this to me. I didn't do anything wrong. Why do they always treat us like this?" There was a pause. "I need you to help me clear this up, to make them see what they did." Elliot felt his frustration rise, his own struggle with the biases he had faced throughout his career, suddenly magnified by his cousin's pain. He had always tried to rise above the noise, to be the example. But now, more than ever, it was clear that rising above was not enough. Something had to change, and he couldn't wait any longer. "I'm going to handle this, Marcus," he said firmly. "We'll get this out there. We'll make sure this doesn't slip through the cracks." His voice was calm, professional, everything he had been trained to be, but inside, a storm was brewing. Elliot got into his car, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. He was preparing himself for what would come next. He had spent years fighting for his place at the table, building his empire from the ground up. But this was different. This wasn't about business anymore. This was about holding people accountable for the prejudice that still controlled so many aspects of society, no matter how much wealth or power you had. Elliot drove through the streets of the city, his mind racing. The protests had started, and Marcus's video was now the rallying cry. He had seen the anger in the faces of the crowd, heard their frustration, and realized that something deeper was at play. As he drove toward the scene, Elliot's heart pounded in his chest. He was about to step into a battle that would test every ounce of his resolve. Would he be able to use his voice to make a difference? Would this moment be the turning point for the city? No. For the world, to finally see the truth about racism and the systems that upheld it. He didn't know the answer yet, but one thing was certain: he was ready to fight. The city had erupted into chaos. What started as a peaceful protest for Marcus had turned into a full-scale public outcry. The video of the incident at the luxury retail store, where Marcus had been accused of theft, despite his professional appearance and lack of wrongdoing, had gone viral. And now, the streets were filled with people demanding justice. The hashtag, #SureJustice, for Marcus, was trending across social media, sparking debates and actions that were long overdue. Elliot could feel the weight of the moment, the pull of history pressing down on his shoulders as he parked his car a few blocks away from the heart of the protests. The crowd had gathered outside the city's central district, where Marcus had been wrongfully detained and mistreated. There was tension in the air, the kind that you could almost taste. Raw, palpable, and filled with the energy of collective frustration. Elliot stepped out of the car, his feet moving toward the protesters with purpose, but his heart heavy. The growing crowd was a reflection of the anger that had been simmering for decades, the feeling that the system had long since stopped working for people like Marcus. As a successful black man, Elliot had always tried to avoid rocking the boat. He had made it to the top through sheer talent and relentless work, not making waves, not drawing attention to his race in spaces where he was constantly questioned. But today, it was different. Today, silence would be complicity. He reached the edge of the protest, where a handful of reporters were interviewing people, their cameras capturing the raw emotion of the crowd. The atmosphere was electric, and the chants of "End racism now" echoed through the streets. Elliot's mind raced as he spotted familiar faces in the crowd, people from his community, his company, even some of Marcus's friends. There was power in numbers, and this movement was no longer just about his cousin. It was about all of them. It was about confronting the very system that had allowed Marcus's mistreatment to happen in the first place. Just then, a flash of blue caught his eye. A police cruiser had pulled up nearby, the officers stepping out with a sense of purpose. As Elliot turned to watch them, his gut twisted with the certainty that the situation was about to escalate. The police had already been called in to manage the protest, he could see it. Their heavy-handed approach, their assumption that the crowd needed to be controlled, not heard. An officer, one that Elliot recognized from his past dealings, Officer Daniels, marched into the center of the protest. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a hard, stern expression on his face. His gaze swept over the crowd, and Elliot immediately tensed. Daniels had never been a fan of protesters, of those who challenged the status quo, and it was clear that his presence here meant trouble. Elliot took a step forward, moving closer to the edge of the protest, where Marcus's friends were gathered. He needed to see his cousin, make sure he was all right. The air was thick with anticipation, the energy of the crowd palpable. There was a mix of fear and defiance in the eyes of those around him. Some held signs demanding justice for Marcus, others wore shirts with slogans calling out racism and inequality. Then, the worst happened. Elliot saw Marcus being led out of a nearby building, his arms restrained by two officers, his head down, looking defeated. Elliot's stomach dropped. It was too late to avoid the confrontation now. As Marcus was escorted toward the police cruiser, Daniels spotted Elliot. There was a moment of recognition, an unsettling flicker of distaste crossing the officer's face. Elliot could feel the tension rising. He had no illusions about the nature of the world he lived in. He knew what Daniels represented. He had seen too many officers like him, people who thrived in the system, using their power to silence others and hold on to their privilege. Daniels was the embodiment of the system, the kind of man who didn't question his role, who saw himself as above reproach. "Mr. Carter," Officer Daniels called out, his voice thick with a subtle mockery. "Nice to see you in the middle of all this." He glanced at the crowd, his tone laced with suspicion. "Your cousin seems to have caused quite the disturbance, doesn't he?" Elliot remained calm, though the anger was building inside of him. He knew that Daniels wasn't speaking to him with respect. He wasn't even pretending to. "He didn't cause anything," Elliot said steadily, trying to keep his voice even. "He was wrongfully accused." Daniels scoffed, his eyes narrowing. "Wrongfully accused, huh? Sounds like you've got a lot of excuses for him. Maybe you should step aside, let the police do their job." Elliot clenched his fists at his sides, his jaw tight. "You don't get to decide what's right here, Daniels," he said, his voice low but firm. "What's happening to Marcus is wrong, and you know it." For a moment, Daniels just stared at him, the tension in the air growing thicker. Then, with a sharp flick of his wrist, he motioned for the officers to move Marcus into the cruiser. "We'll see about that," Daniels said coldly. "Let's see how far you're willing to take this, Mr. Carter." The words stung, but Elliot didn't flinch. He was used to this, used to the undercurrent of racism that ran beneath the surface of every encounter like this. But today, it wasn't going to pass. Not today. Before he could say anything further, a commotion erupted from the crowd. The protesters, seeing Marcus being led away, began chanting louder, their voices rising in unison. "Let him go! Let him go!" The chants grew more forceful, the crowd pushing forward, their collective energy pressing against the police officers. It was clear now. This wasn't just a protest anymore. This was a reckoning. And Elliot felt it deep in his bones. He glanced at Marcus, who was now struggling against the officers. The look of helplessness in his cousin's eyes made Elliot's chest tighten. He couldn't just stand by and watch this happen. Not anymore. Elliot took a deep breath, his fingers curling into a fist, and he made his decision. He stepped forward, moving through the crowd toward Officer Daniels. "You're not taking him anywhere," Elliot said, his voice steady and firm, his eyes locking with the officers. Daniels turned, a sneer playing at the edge of his lips. "What are you going to do about it, Carter?" he spat. "You think you're untouchable, just because you've got a suit and some money. This is bigger than you, this is bigger than your cousin." Elliot took another step forward, not backing down. "This isn't about money or suits, Daniels. This is about what's right, and what you're doing is wrong." The crowd began to murmur, the tension mounting. People were recording now, their phones raised to capture the unfolding scene. Elliot could feel the weight of the moment, could feel the eyes of the crowd on him. This was no longer just a personal battle. It was a battle for something bigger, for the truth to be seen, for Marcus to be freed from the injustice that had shackled him. But as the officers began to push through the crowd, trying to force their way forward, Elliot felt a sharp shove against his back. The force sent him stumbling forward, and he spun around, his eyes landing on the source of the push. A man, dressed in a dark suit, stood there, his face flushed with anger, his hands clenched into fists. "You don't belong here," the man said, his voice low and threatening. "You think your money gives you the right to stand against the system to fight us?" Elliot stood his ground, his posture firm. "I'm not fighting you, I'm fighting the injustice you represent." The man's sneer widened, and he moved forward. But before anything could escalate further, the sound of sirens cut through the air, signaling the arrival of more backup. Elliot knew this was the moment of no return. The stakes had just risen higher. Elliot stood in the heart of the growing chaos, his pulse quickening as the sirens blared louder. The once thriving downtown area had transformed into a battleground between police and protesters. He could feel the weight of the moment, the uncertainty in the air, the desperation, the mounting sense of injustice. And in the midst of it all stood Marcus, being shoved into the back of the police cruiser, his arms pinned behind his back, his face a mix of frustration and fear. Elliot's thoughts were a whirlwind, but his resolve hardened. He could not, would not, stand by any longer. He had come this far. There was no going back now. The realization settled over him like a heavy cloak. This wasn't just about his cousin anymore. This was bigger. The system, the police, even the media. They had all conspired to push back against people like Marcus for too long, to make their voices insignificant. But Elliot knew he wasn't just going to let this go. His gaze locked on Officer Daniels, who stood watching with a smug sense of control. Daniels hadn't even tried to hide the disdain in his eyes, as he looked at the protesters. At Elliot. To him, the situation was just another example of unruly black people pushing boundaries, forcing their way into spaces where they weren't wanted. To Daniels, the rules were simple. They were supposed to know their place. But Elliot refused to let Daniels, or anyone else, decide his place anymore. He had built his empire from the ground up, fighting against every barrier that was put in front of him. Now, standing amidst the growing tension and the crowds of protesters, he understood that he had a responsibility. A weighty one. "Elliot! Wait!" Marcus's voice crackled in his ear from the phone in his pocket. It was shaky, but strong, trying to break through the cacophony around him. "They're going to take me downtown. They won't listen. You can't let them." "I'm right here," Elliot said, cutting him off, as his hand wrapped tightly around the phone. His words were steady, firm. "Hold on, Marcus, I'm coming." He looked up, scanning the scene. Protesters were growing more vocal, pushing closer to the officers who had begun forming a barrier between the crowd and the police cruisers. There was a nervous energy in the air. People were on edge, frustrated with the systemic corruption they had lived with for far too long. "Officer Daniels!" Elliot's voice cut through the crowd, rising above the chanting and the police orders. Daniels turned, his eyes narrowing with irritation when they landed on Elliot. "Mr. Carter," he sneered, the disdain clear. "What is this? You think you can just waltz in here and change things?" "I'm not here to change things, I'm here to stop this injustice," Elliot said, his voice unwavering as he stepped forward. The crowd behind him seemed to pause, their attention shifting to the unfolding confrontation. The energy shifted as more eyes turned toward the two men facing off. Daniels scowled, taking a step forward as if to assert his authority. "You're in the way, Carter. This is bigger than your little, whatever it is you're trying to prove here. Step aside." Elliot didn't flinch. He met Daniels' glare with quiet confidence. "I'm not stepping aside," he said, his voice loud enough for the others around them to hear. "I'm not letting you push him into a system that's already set up to tear him down. You're going to have to answer for what you've done to him." The protesters behind Elliot began murmuring their agreement, and Daniels visibly tensed. His fingers twitched near his belt, but he didn't make a move. "You really think you're going to change anything, huh?" Daniels scoffed. "What do you know about real power? You think you can just throw your weight around, use your money to get things done? You're not fooling anyone." Elliot felt the familiar sting of those words. Money, power, authority. People like Daniels always saw the world as a competition, as a game to win, with rules that only applied to people like him. People who looked like Elliot, with his tailored suits and high-end car, who walked into rooms with their shoulders squared and their titles held high. But it was different now. The game had changed. "I'm not using money to get things done," Elliot said, his words deliberate, each one heavy with purpose. "I'm using the truth, and that's something you can't ignore." He pointed toward the growing crowd behind him. "This isn't just me. This is everyone who's been silenced, ignored, or dismissed by the system. It's time for people like you to be held accountable." The silence that followed was thick, like a breath held too long. Elliot's words seemed to echo across the crowd, bouncing off the walls of the buildings around them. Even Daniels, with all his experience dealing with rowdy crowds, seemed to hesitate for a moment. He glanced nervously at the officers behind him, who were now starting to look less sure of themselves. The crowd's growing anger and the undeniable presence of the media, filming everything, had shifted the dynamic. Then, without warning, One of the protesters, a young woman with a bullhorn, started chanting again. "Justice for Marcus!" she cried. "End police violence! No more silence!" The others around her picked up the chant. "Justice for Marcus! End police violence! No more silence!" The chant rippled through the crowd, louder and more forceful this time. Elliot felt the swell of power in the air as the protesters pushed forward, their voices rising, their demands clear. Officer Daniels shifted on his feet, clearly uncomfortable. He shot Elliot another glare, his jaw clenched as he took a step back. "This isn't over," he muttered under his breath. "You're not going to win this, Carter." But Elliot wasn't done yet. The young man with the phone who had been filming Marcus earlier walked up beside Elliot, his expression resolute. "You're making history right now," he said, his voice a mixture of awe and determination. "We're with you." Elliot nodded, but his gaze remained fixed on Officer Daniels. He could feel the eyes of the protesters on him, their hopes and frustrations hanging on the line of this moment. There was so much more at stake now. Marcus's fate was in the balance, but this was bigger than one man. This was about making sure the world saw the ugly truth, about holding those responsible for systemic racism accountable. The sirens grew louder as more police units began arriving, their presence turning what was a protest into a volatile standoff. Elliot knew they couldn't afford to back down. Not now. "I'm not leaving," he said, his voice steady. "You're going to have to arrest me too if you want me to move." Daniels narrowed his eyes, his body tense. "You're pushing your luck, Carter," he spat. "You think this is a game. I don't care who you are." Elliot held his ground, his chest tight with a mixture of anger and resolve. He wasn't going anywhere, not while Marcus was being treated like this. Just then, a commotion behind the police line drew Elliot's attention. A group of protesters, angry and fed up, had pushed through the barricade, and the officers moved in quickly, trying to keep the crowd under control. A flash of movement caught Elliot's eye, and he saw one of the officers grab a protester by the arm, slamming them against the wall. "That's enough!" Elliot shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. He wasn't just watching this happen, he was going to do something about it. He rushed forward, determined to stop this escalation before it went any further. But as he made his move, the sound of a heavy footstep behind him stopped him cold. The situation had just reached a boiling point. Elliot stood in the thick of the standoff, feeling every inch of tension in the air. The streets were loud with protest, the cries of "Justice for Marcus" and "End police brutality" reverberating off the surrounding buildings. The police, more and more arriving with each passing minute, were beginning to form a rigid barricade. Sirens were still blaring in the distance, amplifying the sense of urgency and rising fear. Yet Elliot remained calm, resolute, unshaken by the chaos surrounding him. This wasn't just a protest anymore. It was a moment that could change everything. He had prepared for this moment for years. Years of navigating the upper echelons of corporate America, where the looks of suspicion followed him into boardrooms, the whispered judgments about his place in society stung every day. But this was different. This wasn't a world of profit margins and stock options. This was about life and dignity. This was about fighting a system that had decided who he and his cousin were, without ever taking the time to understand who they actually were. Daniels, the officer, stood only a few feet away. The distance between them seemed to close with every angry inch of his posture. He shot Elliot another look, more venomous this time. It was clear. Daniels wasn't backing down, and neither was Elliot. "You really think you can make a difference here, Carter?" Officer Daniels sneered, his voice filled with sarcasm. "You think you're going to waltz in here, with your fancy title and your high-rise, and change the way things are?" Elliot's eyes locked onto Daniels's with a steady, unwavering gaze. He could feel the hostility radiating from the officer, the subtle sneer, the tightening of his fists. He had dealt with this before. This subtle, insidious way that people like Daniels use their power to remind others of their place. He had always walked the fine line of maintaining his professionalism, carefully considering each interaction. But today, it was different. He couldn't, no, wouldn't, allow this injustice to continue, not with Marcus's future on the line. "This isn't about me," Elliot said, his voice quiet but strong, cutting through the rising tension. "This is about what's right. What you did to my cousin, what you did to people like him, for no reason other than your ignorance and your prejudice." Daniels took a step forward, pushing past the small crowd of officers. His hands were clenched into fists, his face flushed red with a mix of frustration and fury. The other protesters and officers seemed to pause, sensing the impending confrontation. "You think you're so much better than the rest of us, don't you?" Daniels spat. "Just because you've got a few dollars and a nice car doesn't mean you're above the law, it doesn't make you special." Elliot held his ground, his expression unwavering. He didn't flinch, didn't even bat an eye. He had been told he wasn't above the law more times than he could count. But he wasn't here to argue about his wealth or his status. He was here because a man, his cousin, Marcus, had been wrongfully accused and humiliated in front of the world, and Elliot wasn't about to let that go unchallenged. "It's not about the car, Daniels," Elliot replied, his voice steady and firm. "It's about the fact that the system is broken. It's about the fact that you and your fellow officers thought you could destroy my cousin's life for something that wasn't his fault." His words carried the weight of years of frustration. "And now, you're about to do the same to an entire movement, to an entire community that's been silenced for far too long." Daniels's nostrils flared. The self-righteousness in his posture was palpable. He was used to wielding power. He was used to being the one who made the decisions, who didn't have to answer to anyone. People like Elliot, people like Marcus. They were beneath him in his eyes, and he intended to keep it that way. "You think this is some movement?" Daniels mocked, his voice growing louder. "You think your cousin is some martyr? You're all the same, standing there, talking about justice, thinking you're somehow right, but you're not. You're a joke. And when this is all over, you'll realize that you've made a fool of yourself." The words stung. Elliot could feel the anger rising in him, the old resentment flaring. But he had learned long ago how to stay composed, how to turn his fury into something stronger, something more deliberate. "No, Daniels," Elliot said, his voice growing firmer. "What's a joke is thinking that people like you can keep getting away with this. You've been letting this rot for years, hiding behind your badge and your excuses. But today you're going to be exposed for what you are. A coward. A man who hides behind the law because he's too scared to face his own prejudice." The crowd behind them began to murmur in agreement. The young man with the camera, who had been filming from the sidelines, raised his phone higher, capturing every moment. The atmosphere had shifted. There was no going back now. The cameras were on them. The world was watching. Daniels's face turned even redder, his jaw tightening. For a brief moment, Elliot saw fear flash in the officer's eyes, fear that the carefully constructed walls he had built, his authority, his position, were about to come crashing down, but that fear quickly turned into something else. Rage. Daniels took a step forward, his hands clenched. "You think you're going to come in here and make this right, huh?" Daniels hissed. "You think you're going to walk away from this without consequences? You don't get it. People like you, people who challenge the system, don't get to win. You never do." Elliot could feel the weight of those words. The threat in Daniels' voice hung in the air like smoke. It was a moment of reckoning. He knew that it wasn't just about his cousin anymore. It wasn't just about one moment. This was the culmination of decades of systemic oppression, and Daniels, along with everyone else in that system, was finally being held accountable. For a brief second, it seemed like Daniels might act on his anger. His body tensed as though he were about to grab Elliot, to escalate this moment into something physical. But then a voice from behind stopped him cold. "Enough." Elliot turned to see Mitchell, one of the protesters who had been quietly supporting him from the start. Mitchell had been a hesitant figure up until now, but there was something different in his eyes today. He was tired of the system too. Tired of watching it crumble, tired of seeing people like Marcus and Elliot fight a losing battle. Today, Mitchell stood taller, more determined. "Don't you dare lay a hand on him," Mitchell said, his voice low but firm. He stepped between Daniels and Elliot, his posture tense but unyielding. Daniels glared at him, then back at Elliot, his hand still hovering at his belt, as if weighing the consequences of what to do next. The crowd was silent now, every eye trained on the three men. The tension in the air was thick enough to suffocate. "You're making a mistake, Daniels," Elliot said, his voice carrying authority now, the years of strategic thinking coming into play. "This isn't just about me or my cousin, it's about the fact that your world is crumbling. You can't push us around anymore. You can't treat us like we don't matter." The words landed like a blow. Daniels froze, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. But Elliot knew the game wasn't over yet. He had no illusions that this was going to end neatly. The stakes had never been higher, and yet the battle was only just beginning. As the sirens continued to wail and the crowd surged with energy, Elliot realized something crucial. This wasn't just about one man's fate, it was about the future. The future where people like Daniels could no longer hold power, where the weight of their prejudice would no longer silence the voices of the marginalized. Elliot took a deep breath. "You've lost, Daniels," he said, his voice quiet but filled with certainty. "You've already lost, but we're just getting started." Just as Daniels opened his mouth to respond, a figure appeared from the crowd. A reporter, phone in hand, her voice rising above the others. "What are you doing to stop the violence against Marcus Carter?" she shouted. "Are you really going to arrest him, knowing what happened?" The question hung in the air like a final challenge, one that Daniels wasn't prepared to answer. He stammered for a moment, but there was nothing left to say. Elliot looked around at the sea of faces, now turned in his direction. The protesters were no longer passive. They had seen the truth. Elliot stood just a few feet away from Officer Daniels, their faces close enough to feel the tension crackling in the air. The crowd behind them had quieted, their anticipation hanging heavy like a storm about to break. Daniels was still seething, his hands twitching at his sides, as though ready to strike out at any moment. His gaze flickered from Elliot to the other officers, each one unsure of their next move. This wasn't just about enforcing the law anymore. It had turned into a battle of wills. "You really think you can just waltz in here and make a difference, don't you?" Daniels spat, his voice rising with barely contained fury. "You think your shiny suits and all the money you've got make you better than me, or the system you can't change this. You won't win people like you never do." Elliot's lips tightened, but his voice was calm, steady. He had faced much worse than this. He had fought for everything he had. Now, standing here, facing Daniels, he realized how much bigger this fight had become. It wasn't just about Marcus anymore. It was about what kind of society they were willing to build. A society that allowed power to go unchecked, or one where people could stand together against the forces trying to silence them. "People like me?" Elliot repeated, his voice low but filled with purpose. "You mean people who actually care about doing what's right, about standing up when they see injustice?" He stepped closer, his eyes locking onto Daniels, unwavering. "I'm not here to prove anything about my wealth or my status, Daniels. I'm here to make sure that the system that you defend, the system that's failed Marcus and so many others, doesn't keep doing its dirty work." Daniels' chest heaved as he took a step toward Elliot, his voice growing louder. "You think you're some hero, huh? You think you're some kind of savior? You think I'm the problem? You're just as guilty as I am. You're just as complicit in the mess we've made of this world. And when it comes down to it, you're going to find out that people like you, people who think they can change the world with their high ideals, don't ever win." Elliot felt the bite of Daniel's words, the stinging reminder that in the world of power and privilege, people like him were too often written off. His mind raced for a moment, but then something deep inside him shifted. Anger, yes, but also a clear vision of what he needed to do. The truth. It was simple, but powerful. The truth would always win, and it was his responsibility now to make sure it was heard. "I don't need to be a hero, Daniels," Elliot said, standing tall. "I don't need a cape. What I need is for you to listen, and for you to understand that this—" He waved his hand around to encompass the protesters, the media, the scene unfolding on the streets. "This is the sound of people who are done being ignored, done being marginalized." Daniels glared at him, eyes narrowing. "You're just a pawn in a game, Carter. All of this is just noise. It'll pass. Everything passes, just like the other protests, just like the others who thought they could change things." His lip curled, his voice dripping with derision. "Your cousin. He's just a casualty of a world that won't change, and you're too blinded by your own sense of justice to see it." The words stung, and yet they sharpened Elliot's focus. He could feel the weight of every word that Daniels had thrown at him, every slander, every misjudgment. But he was done. Done with being told he didn't belong. Done with being told that the lives of people like Marcus, like him, didn't matter. "That's where you're wrong, Daniels," Elliot said, stepping forward. The crowd was watching now, the tension palpable, and he could see the curiosity in their eyes. They were waiting to see what happened next, whether this moment would be another brief flash in the pan, or something bigger. He wouldn't let them down. He wouldn't let himself down. This isn't about whether you think change is possible. It's about whether we believe it's possible. And we do. We believe it's time to tear this system down. The silence that followed was thick, each person holding their breath, each eye locked on the two of them. Elliot felt the eyes of the protesters on him. He felt their energy, their collective hope and frustration. He was carrying more than his own fight now. He was carrying their voices, their demands for justice. "You know what your problem is, Daniels," Elliot said, his voice cutting through the tension. "You've spent your entire life thinking you're above the law, above the people you're supposed to protect. You've used your badge as a weapon to break people down, to tell them they don't matter. But I'm here to show you that you're wrong. Your system is broken, and no matter how many people you've pushed aside, you can't silence all of us." The words hung in the air, echoing, stirring something deep in the crowd. Daniels opened his mouth, as though to respond, but the words caught in his throat. Elliot had struck a chord, but before the officer could find his voice, something unexpected happened. A voice rang out from the crowd. "He's right. This system is broken, and it's time we hold you accountable." Elliot's eyes flickered toward the speaker. A young woman, standing near the edge of the crowd, her eyes fierce with resolve. Others began murmuring their agreement. Elliot saw heads nodding, fists raising. There was a shift, and in that moment, he realized it wasn't just his words that had reached them. It was the collective roar of those who had had enough. Daniels's face twisted with fury, his hand shooting up to grab at the radio on his belt. "Enough!" he shouted. "I'm calling this in. We need backup now." The sirens grew louder, more pronounced. Police vehicles began to fill the street, a wall of blue and red flashing lights. Elliot knew that backup was not just a show of force, it was a sign that Daniels knew he was losing control. The truth was slipping through his fingers. "You think you can intimidate me with your backup?" Elliot said, stepping forward. He didn't back down, didn't flinch as the new officers moved into position. "You think you can push me around just because you got a badge? You think we're afraid of you?" The crowd behind Elliot seemed to surge forward, their energy shifting into something even more potent. People started chanting again, but this time, it wasn't just a simple slogan, it was a demand. "Justice for Marcus. Justice for us all." Daniels's face went pale, his previous bravado evaporating as the numbers of protesters and the sound of their collective voice made it clear. His time was up. He had underestimated them. He had underestimated Elliot. "I'm not the one you should be afraid of," Elliot said, his voice firm, unwavering. "I'm not the one who's been abusing power. The one you should be worried about is the truth that people like you can't hide anymore." Daniels stepped back, his chest heaving with anger, but the damage had been done. His authority had cracked. He was no longer in control. And the officers around him, who had been blindly following his lead, were beginning to question him. They shifted on their feet, glancing at each other, unsure of how to proceed. Elliot took another step forward, his gaze locked onto Daniels. The world seemed to slow down for a moment. The chant of the crowd became a roar. The camera flashes from the media became blinding, and in the midst of it all, Elliot stood tall, his voice cutting through the noise. "You're done, Daniels," Elliot said. "You've lost. This isn't just about me or Marcus anymore. This is about all of us. We won't let you break us down anymore." Daniels was still seething, his hands trembling at his sides, but there was nothing left to say. The crowd's roar drowned out his protests. He knew, deep down, that the battle was over. The officer turned to his colleagues, his expression filled with rage and frustration. "I'm done," he muttered under his breath, stepping away from Elliot. The other officers, for the first time, looked at him. Not as their superior, but as a man who had lost his grip on the power he had once held so easily. The crowd, sensing victory, erupted into cheers. Elliot felt the adrenaline surge through him, but it wasn't over yet. This was only the beginning. They had taken down one piece of the system, but there was still more to fight for. He knew that, but for the first time, he felt hopeful. He had helped shift the tide, and that feeling was enough for now. But as the crowd began to disperse, and the media frenzy continued to swirl around him, Elliot couldn't help but wonder what would come next. He had exposed Daniels, he had exposed the system, but the real fight was just beginning. The air was thick with the aftermath of the confrontation. The sounds of protesters chanting and police sirens faded into the distance as Elliot stood in the middle of the chaos. It was over. Officer Daniels had backed down, his authority shattered by the weight of the truth, by the voices of the crowd, and by Elliot's unwavering determination. For a brief moment, it felt like the fight was won, but Elliot knew that this was only the beginning. The struggle for justice, for equality, would not end with the resignation of one officer. The system that allowed men like Daniels to thrive wasn't going to change overnight. Still, there was something unmistakable in the air, a shift, a ripple of hope that had spread through the crowd and beyond. Something was changing. The media, cameras flashing, swarmed around Elliot. They had been recording every moment of the confrontation, and the footage was already making waves across social media. News outlets were picking up the story, focusing not only on the disgraceful actions of Officer Daniels, but on the bravery of the protesters, and of course, on Elliot. His calm defiance in the face of such intense adversity had captivated the masses. A reporter, breathless from the scene, approached him, her microphone in hand. "Mr. Carter, how do you feel now that the officer has been exposed for his actions?" she asked, her eyes wide with anticipation. Elliot didn't flinch as the camera focused on him. His voice was steady, but the emotion behind it was undeniable. "This isn't just about one officer," he said, his words deliberate. "This is about a system that has allowed people like Officer Daniels to act with impunity. What we've done here today is show that we're not afraid to stand up to that system, to call out injustice where we see it. But this is just one battle. There's more work to be done." The reporter nodded, capturing his every word. "And what's next for you, Mr. Carter?" Elliot paused for a moment, his eyes scanning the crowd. He saw people standing taller now, their expressions filled with a sense of pride and victory. They had seen the power of collective action. They had witnessed what could happen when one person decided they wouldn't back down. "We keep fighting," Elliot replied. "We continue to demand accountability, not just from the police, but from every institution that has upheld a system of inequality. This is about more than just one case. It's about changing the way we all live, the way we all interact with one another. If today shows us anything, it's that we are stronger together." As he spoke, the crowd began to disperse, their chants slowing, but their energy still high. They had won this moment. But Elliot knew it wasn't over. The truth had been exposed, and now it was time for the consequences to unfold. The following days were a whirlwind. The video footage of the confrontation with Officer Daniels had gone viral, sparking conversations and debates across social media, news stations, and public forums. The hashtag Justice for Marcus began trending worldwide, and soon, Elliot found himself inundated with messages of support from people all over the country. The protests, that had started as a small demonstration, had turned into a movement that couldn't be ignored. The pressure on the police department and the city government mounted quickly. Public outcry over the treatment of Marcus and the actions of Officer Daniels reached a fever pitch. A formal investigation was launched into Daniels's behavior, and, soon after, a series of internal reviews began looking at the systemic failures within the police department itself. Daniels was placed on administrative leave while the investigation was underway, and the calls for his resignation grew louder with each passing day. Elliot, however, wasn't satisfied. While the immediate victory had been important, he knew that this was only one officer. The real battle lay in holding the entire system accountable. "I won't let them sweep this under the rug," Elliot said, speaking with Angela Martin, his civil rights attorney, as they sat in her office, reviewing the case files. "We need to go after the department, the people who enabled this kind of behavior. Daniels didn't act alone." Angela nodded, her expression focused. "You're right. This is bigger than one officer. We've already got the evidence to build a case against him, but we need to show the public that the department itself is complicit in this kind of behavior. We need to make sure they can't hide behind their walls of silence anymore." Elliot leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the armrest. "I'm ready for this. I don't care what it takes. We'll go all the way." Angela's eyes softened, and she gave him a reassuring smile. "You've already done something amazing, Elliot, but this next step, it's going to take everything you've got. We'll need the public on our side, we'll need more evidence, and we'll need to stay strong. The system is going to fight back. You're asking for change at the very core of how things are done." Elliot's resolve only hardened. "I didn't come this far to turn back. Now I know what's at stake. This isn't just about the police department, this is about the future. This is about making sure no one has to go through what Marcus did again. No one should ever feel like they don't matter." As the investigation into Officer Daniels continued, the story began to gain traction in ways no one had expected. Other victims of police misconduct and racial profiling started to come forward, sharing their own stories, emboldened by the exposure Daniels had received. The media followed the trail, uncovering a pattern of abuse within the police department, complaints that had been filed and ignored, cases of excessive force that had never been investigated properly. The local government was forced to respond. They issued statements acknowledging the public outcry, and the mayor announced that reforms would be put in place. The police department promised sensitivity training for all officers, and an independent oversight committee was formed to ensure that complaints were taken seriously. Elliot watched these developments with a mix of cautious optimism and skepticism. The words were one thing, but real change, systemic change, would take action. The road ahead was still filled with obstacles, but the momentum was growing. And as much as Elliot wanted to believe that these reforms would make a difference, he knew that true change would only come when the people who had been silenced for so long continued to rise, continued to fight. He would keep pushing, not just for Marcus, but for every person who had been wronged by a system that too often failed to see them as human. A few weeks later, Elliot found himself standing in a crowded courtroom, once again at the center of the story. The trial against Officer Daniels had begun. It was a pivotal moment, not just for Marcus, but for the entire community, and Elliot was ready. He had already given his statement, his testimony, a strong, unwavering account of what had happened on that fateful day. Angela had fought tirelessly, ensuring that the case would be heard by the right people, those who could see the truth and make the right decision. As the trial progressed, the truth of Daniels's actions became undeniable. The evidence was overwhelming. His history of complaints, the video footage, the testimonies from the witnesses. The jury couldn't ignore it any longer. The moment the verdict was read, guilty of assault and misconduct, Elliot exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The room was silent for a moment, and then, as if a weight had been lifted, the applause began. It was quiet at first, but then louder, stronger, as people stood to their feet. It wasn't just a victory for Marcus, it was a victory for everyone who had been part of this fight, everyone who had witnessed what Daniels had done and said, "No more." The days that followed were a blur, but the message was clear. Change was possible. The department was forced to make real reforms, and other cases of police misconduct were finally brought into the light. But Elliot knew the battle wasn't over. He had learned something about the power of collective action, the power of standing firm in the face of injustice. He had seen how people who were once silent could find their voices, how the system could be challenged, how the truth could be a weapon for change, and he was ready for the next fight. The days following the trial were quieter, but no less significant. As Elliot Carter walked down the familiar streets of his neighborhood, he couldn't help but reflect on the journey he'd been through. The uncertainty, the frustration, the moments of doubt, and the flashes of hope that had carried him forward. He had been forced to confront the very system he had worked so hard to navigate, to rise above. But it wasn't just his own fight anymore. It was a collective one. And through it, he had come to understand something fundamental. Real change came when people, individuals like him, were willing to stand up and say, "Enough." The verdict had been a victory, yes, but the real triumph lay in what it had inspired. A ripple effect of courage and accountability that had spread beyond the courtroom, beyond the police department, and out into the wider community. People had spoken up. They had been heard. The truth, so long buried under layers of systemic bias and corruption, had come to light. And it was impossible to ignore. Elliot had always prided himself on his ability to stay focused, to keep his emotions in check. But this fight had stripped away the armor he had built around himself. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to feel the weight of the battle. He had fought, not just for Marcus, not just for his own sense of justice, but for every single person who had ever been marginalized, silenced, or overlooked. And in doing so, he had learned more about himself than he ever expected. The fight had changed him, made him realize that resilience wasn't about bending to the system's will, but about challenging it, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. Elliot Carter had always been driven by a sense of responsibility, not just to his career, his family, or his wealth, but to the world around him. He had worked hard to build his own empire, to succeed in a society that had often viewed people like him with skepticism, but his experiences had taught him that success was not just about money or power. True success came from using that power to change the world for the better, to fight for those who didn't have a voice, to confront systems of oppression that still plagued every corner of society. Before the confrontation with Officer Daniels, Elliot had never imagined that his path would intersect with the fight for racial justice. He had always thought that his success and his position in the corporate world had given him the tools he needed to survive, to rise above the struggles of others. But now, he understood that those tools weren't enough, not if the systems of inequality were allowed to persist. The fight had tested his limits, pushed him in ways he hadn't expected. It wasn't just about standing firm against one man's prejudice, it was about confronting a larger, more insidious force that had been in place for generations. And while the battle against Officer Daniels had been a personal one, the war against a system that allowed such behavior to thrive was far from over. Elliot had learned the value of community. His position had allowed him to work alongside influential allies, but it was the collective power of those who had stood with him, the protesters, the witnesses, the ordinary people who had refused to stay silent, that had made the difference. He realized now that the system could only be dismantled if people came together to demand change, if they forced those in power to recognize their collective strength. As he looked ahead, Elliot was resolute. He had been changed by this experience, but it had also solidified his commitment to using his platform, his resources, and his voice for the greater good. The victory in the courtroom had been an important step, but it was only the beginning. The fight for justice would continue, through policy reforms, through the voices of activists, and through the power of ordinary people standing up and saying, "No more." Elliot's personal journey had mirrored the struggles of countless others, and through his actions, he had exposed a truth that could no longer be ignored. Systemic racism, prejudice, and abuse of power were not isolated incidents, but part of a larger pattern that shaped society. Officer Daniels' behavior had been a symptom of a deeply ingrained issue, one that had affected countless people in similar ways. The public outrage over Marcus's treatment and the subsequent confrontation had sparked a movement, one that would not be easily extinguished. The case had not only exposed the failures of the police department, but also the broader systemic issues within institutions that had long been complicit in perpetuating inequality. The trial had revealed that the problem was not just with a single officer or a single incident. It was a systemic failure, a failure that had been allowed to persist for far too long. Through the work of activists, lawyers, and community leaders like Elliot, the pressure on the city government had mounted, forcing them to make changes. The mayor had announced new measures, including greater oversight of police practices and mandatory anti-bias training for officers. But Elliot knew that these were just small steps. The real change would come when institutions, not just individuals, were held accountable. The ripple effect had spread across the country, and Elliot had become a symbol of resilience, a reminder that no one, no matter how powerful or untouchable they may seem, was immune to accountability. The protests that had grown in the wake of the case were proof of that people were standing up, raising their voices, and demanding that the world recognize their humanity. And for the first time, the systems that had long benefited from silence were being forced to listen. As the days passed and the aftermath of the trial settled into a new routine, Elliot's thoughts turned to the future. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. He had seen the power of collective action, the power of people coming together to demand justice. It had been a pivotal moment, but it had also shown him how far there was still to go. The change they had fought for was not an isolated event. It was part of a larger movement, a movement that needed every voice, every person, to be heard. Elliot had made his stand, and he knew that others would continue to take up the mantle. He would continue to lead the charge for justice, but now he understood that this was a shared responsibility. It was a call to action for everyone who believed in equality, in fairness, and in the power of standing up to injustice. His fight had sparked something in others, something that couldn't be extinguished. The journey would be long, and the challenges would be many, but Elliot knew one thing. Change was possible. It had happened before, and with enough determination, enough resolve, it would happen again. He wanted people to know that their voices mattered, that no matter how difficult the struggle, no matter how oppressive the system, they could stand up and demand change. You can make a difference, he thought, as he walked down the steps of the courthouse, his heart still beating with the power of the moment. We all can. The journey was far from over. But in that moment, Elliot understood that they had taken the first step toward a world where justice was not just an ideal, but a reality. As the crowds dispersed, and the news stories began to shift to other matters, Elliot stood alone for a moment, taking it all in. The noise of the world seemed distant, but inside, he felt the echoes of the battle they had fought. A new world was waiting. It wouldn't be easy to get there, and it wouldn't be without setbacks, but as he stood tall and walked away, there was a quiet hope in his heart. The world had taken notice. And now, it was time to act. He had come so far, and no matter what came next, he knew one thing. The fight for justice was not a sprint. It was a marathon. And this was just the beginning.